Welcome back, guys, to Dark Night Scare. In today's episode, I'm sharing 12 true disturbing stories about the Appalachian Mountains. Stories of people who ventured deep into the woods and came back with something that wasn't entirely human. So, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, share this with your friends, and let me know where you're watching from. Thanks. Now, let's get into it. I'm Brandon, and at 28, I made the decision to disconnect from civilization for a bit and hike a stretch of the Appalachian Mountains alone, way out in western North Carolina, where the trails begin to feel less marked and more like mere suggestions. I wasn't on a quest for spiritual enlightenment or anything grand like that. Honestly, I needed clarity. I had quit my corporate job a week prior, mundane work, and ended a 4-year relationship that felt more like a rut than a connection. I had also backed out of an apartment lease I couldn't afford. Everything collapsed simultaneously, as if what I thought was stable had shattered in slow motion. I didn't even feel sadness, just emptiness. So, I loaded my frame backpack with supplies for 5 days, a backup charger, paper maps, first aid kit, the works, tossed everything in the car, and drove toward a section of the trail I had yet to visit. I craved peace. No fellow hikers, no kids attached to Bluetooth speakers, just open space. The first few hours matched my expectations. Trail markers and signposts, a few laminated notices warning about bears and falling rocks. I stopped at a tiny ranger station near the trail's beginning, a single room with a desk and some maps, faint pine cleaner scent lingering in the air. I intended to sign in and inform someone of my destination while asking about quieter spots devoid of selfie-taking influences. The ranger inside looked to be in his 60s. He resembled a wooden carving with his harsh face, sharp eyes, and pale skin that hadn't seen sunlight for weeks. His neck displaying a thick red band reminiscent of an old sunburn. No name tag and no smile were offered, just a long, scrutinizing look. "Looking for company or solitude?" he asked flatly. "Solitude, for sure," I replied. "Just want to get away for a bit." He observed me for an elongated moment, then wordlessly produced a laminated topographical map, spread it over the desk, and grabbed a red pen from a coffee mug. Most paths were marked in green and yellow, clearly maintained, yet he traced a jagged red line diverging from a side road. It was a narrow, crooked spur leading nowhere. From what I could tell, you take this for about 7, maybe 8 miles. Used to lead to a fire tower. Tower's gone now. No one goes out there anymore. I inquired about its safety. He provided neither a yes nor a no, merely continued staring as if that question held no weight. I snapped a photo of the map to keep on my phone and thanked him before departing. I hiked for 2 solid days without encountering anyone at all. The trail he indicated wasn't exactly welcoming. Parts of it were overgrown and others worn away by erosion. Still, it felt like a trail, showing signs of existence. Old markers here and there, rusty nails nailed into trees, wooden posts leaning precariously. It exuded a sense of abandonment, but not complete forgetfulness. By late afternoon on the 3rd day, I reached the trail's end. Not fading out or slowly summoning undergrowth, it simply ceased. One moment I was on dirt, and with the next step the ground gave way to just leaves and moss. No markers, no signs, no forks I might have missed. I stood there for perhaps a minute, rotating slowly in circles to ensure I hadn't overlooked something. But all I saw was forest in every direction, a silence that pressed down on me. No birds, no insects. Just that eerie stillness that takes hold when you've been alone for too long. I pulled out my phone, and while the map photo was still open, the red line clearly continued onward. Still, no trail remained to match it. This is when I detected footsteps. At first they were soft, delicate, perhaps a deer or some creature, but the rhythm felt off, too steady, 2 feet, one dragging along as if it had a limp. My body locked as I turned swiftly, heart racing. A man stood approximately 20 yards away, merely watching me. He was mostly concealed between 2 trees, motionless, garbed in an old ranger uniform, a forest green shirt, those rigid cargo pants, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. I couldn't see his eyes, only the jawline and the skin on his neck, which appeared oddly coloured, not quite pale, but more of a grey-like shade like bruised clay. I called out, "Hey, I think I'm lost." No answer, nada. Not even the slightest indication he acknowledged my presence. "I was told this trail leads to a fire tower," I added, while explaining I was following the map. The ranger stood as still as ever, arms at his sides, lacking any gear, pack, radio, nothing coherent. "Hello?" I called. With no response, he silently turned, entering the woods. For reasons I can't quite articulate, I followed. I reacted without thinking. I felt a blind need not to be left alone. Rationalizing, I told myself he must be a ranger who simply couldn't hear me. Even though I knew better, I called out 2 or 3 more times, yet he continued on apathetically, maintaining that steady, dragging pace. His limp became increasingly visible. 1 foot would scuff the dirt with every step. I expected him to pause, glance back, or provide direction on where we were headed, but he did none of that. I followed him through trees and over twisted roots, negotiating fallen branches while ducking under lower limbs. Suddenly, we arrived at a tiny clearing featuring a 1-room wooden cabin at the center. Not a fire tower or shelter, but a decrepit cabin with old windows bordered with uneven planks and a roof that had partially collapsed. He remained stationary outside the cabin, so I approached and asked, "Is this yours?" Silence again. Maneuvering closer allowed clearer visibility of his features. A mistake. The left side of his face looked distorted, like the skin was pulled tight over the bone and then left to dry. His jaw didn't match the rest of his skull. The angle appeared wrong, and his eyes had been positioned too wide and too low. It appeared as if someone took creative liberty where they shouldn't have. Eventually, he opened his mouth, initially resembling a yawn, yet it didn't end. His jaw just kept extending wider, past the threshold where normality stops. There were no sounds emitted, just this silent tearing motion, as though his face were disassembling. Without hesitating, I turned and ran. My legs moved instinctively before I could piece together the decision. Direction bore no consequence. I fled into the trees, branches slapping against my face, arms and chest. I heard him behind, that dragging step cleaving through the brush, closing the gap between us. Once I stumbled and hit a stump with enough force to momentarily incapacitate me. I got up and continued, never looking back. I couldn't. And then, as if birthed from nowhere, a ravine presented itself. I slid halfway down the slope, palms scraping and knees bleeding, lungs burning fiercely. Pushing onward, I finally found it. A real path, wide and solid. Someone else was present. A woman with a substantial backpack and trekking poles was strolling ahead, steady and composed. I said nothing, just made a noise, loud and panicky, not requiring words. She turned swiftly, noticed me, and stepped toward me, asking, "You okay?" I again looked back, but nothing emerged. No sounds, just trees. She accompanied me to her camp, a mile away, offering me half a protein bar and remaining by my side as I attempted to explain the events. The man, the trail terminating, the cabin, and the warped face. Upon mentioning Ranger, her expression shifted. She appeared confused and clarified that section hadn't had a ranger on site for over a year. The following morning, I finally gained a bar of signal and hiked back to the visitor station. A different individual attended the desk, a younger, amiable guy. I mentioned, "A few days ago I talked to an older ranger here, pale, kind of intense. He provided me a map with a red route leading to a fire tower." His expression shifted to one of disapproval. "What did he look like?" I detailed every aspect of his appearance. The younger ranger shook his head. "We don't employ anyone resembling that description. Not in quite a while. And there's been no tower atop that trail in 20 years. In disbelief, I pulled out my phone to display the photo of the map, yet it was blank. Not deleted, but showing only a grey screen as though the image had never loaded. I drove home that afternoon and never returned to a trail again. My name is Elric. I set out to complete a loop in 7 days, a full backcountry circuit through the southern Appalachians, starting at Coldwater Ridge in North Carolina, traversing through the Smokies, then looping back to the state line. It was one of those trips I had discussed doing for years but kept postponing. Then one morning, I simply got into the car and went. No countdown, no farewell messages, just me and a packed rucksack. When I closed the car door in the gravel trailhead lot, I didn't check my phone, didn't take a photo, and didn't send a message. I left it all in the glove compartment without a second thought. Or perhaps I was more conscious of it than I'd like to admit. It felt as though if I looked back, even for a moment, something might pull me back home before I even began. The first day was a breeze. The air was crisp, the trail dry, and my boots felt comfortable. I encountered 2 groups coming from the opposite direction. a trio of retirees with walking poles and wide sun hats, and a couple of German guys seemingly auditioning for a Nordic survival show, complete with poles, GoPros, and matching vests. We exchanged nods and smiles and went our separate ways. By the third day, I hadn't seen another person in over 24 hours. It didn't bother me. In fact, I appreciated it. Every little detail had been thoroughly planned. Weight distribution in my pack, freeze-dried meals, a backup filter, and a GPS beacon with a fresh battery. I'd even packed a laminated map just in case. The overall goal was control. No schedule, no noise, no texts or emails or mundane chatter, just the trail. That morning, I woke up feeling cold. Frost had spread across the tent's interior like a thin film, and the air stung my nose as I sat up. I boiled water for coffee, watching the sun creep over the ridge. The entire valley gradually glowed. I recalled thinking, really reflecting, that maybe I should stay out here longer. Not indefinitely, but perhaps for a few extra weeks. Perhaps I didn't need to return just yet. That afternoon I saw him. Rounding a slight bend on an incline, he materialized about 20 or 30 feet ahead, standing still in the middle of the trail. I gradually came to a halt. He looked off, his clothing was torn. The left leg of his pants was ripped from thigh to hem, dangling in tatters. His leg underneath was caked with blood, featuring a long, raw-looking gash. His face, good lord. Scratches lined both cheeks and his forehead as if he had face-planted into a thorn bush. Blood was crusted at the corners of his mouth. He lacked a backpack, gear, or shoes. I remained stationary and lifted my hand. "You okay?" I inquired, keeping my voice calm and steady, even as I calculated each possible escape route in my mind. He didn't reply. His eyes never focused on me. They simply scanned past me as if I were merely a tree or part of the trail. His lips were moving rapidly, repetitively whispering something I couldn't decipher. "Sir," I implored, "do you need help?" He didn't glance my way, didn't blink, just brushed past me like I didn't exist and continued limping down the trail. I turned to watch him depart, remaining still, not following. I stood frozen in place until I could no longer hear the sound of his footsteps. No scream, no thud, nothing. Eventually, I resumed walking. By dusk, I reached a campsite beside a narrow stream. Clear water, flat ground, plenty of cover, practically perfect. I set up my gear, boiled water, dumped a pouch of beef stew into the pot, and forced myself to eat, even though my stomach felt like it was closing up. I zipped into my bag and attempted to sleep. I awoke to footsteps, not stomping, not rustling, merely footsteps, deliberate, crunching through leaves, slow and spaced apart. Step, pause, step, pause. I didn't breathe, didn't move. They halted just outside my tent. My knife was in the mesh pocket above my head. I reached for it slowly. Every sound felt deafening within that nylon cocoon. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the tent. One entire lap, then silence. No voice, no breath, nothing. I can't recall sleeping. I only remember lying there with the blade in my hand, waiting for the zipper to budge. At first light, I broke camp in under 10 minutes and was back on the trail without breakfast. My legs felt stiff, but adrenaline kicked in. An hour later, I saw the first sign, nailed to a birch tree at eye level. Scratched letters, uneven, chipped. Not safe past here. Turn back. No logos, no park insignia. I stared at it, trying to discern whether it was a prank or an unofficial warning. I snapped a photo just in case. 5 minutes later, another sign. Same message, same carving. Then a third one, half buried in the dirt off the trail, tilted like someone had tossed it. After that, the trail transformed. The trees became denser, the path more constricted. Branches snagged at my pack and face. The atmosphere felt darker, quieter. I had to duck and sidestep continually. That's when I began hearing it, a whisper. Initially, I thought it was the wind passing through the trees, but then I discerned words. She saw it. I froze again, closer now, just behind me. She saw it. I spun around but saw only trees. Nothing moved. I whipped out my GPS, no signal. The offline map still indicated I was on the trail, but my surroundings didn't align with anything I remembered. No blazes, no markers, just wilderness and that whisper trailing behind me. Then I spotted it, the cabin. It remained hidden until I was nearly upon it, nestled in a low dip off the trail. Old wood, some parts charred, collapsing, windows mere gaps. The door creaked open as if someone had been about to shut it but changed their mind. I told myself not to venture closer, actually vocalized nope out loud, but still took a step toward it. Inside, the air reeked of decay, wet wood and something metallic, like blood. There was only one object in the room, a wooden chair in the center facing the door. It was raw, stripped of finish, with deep drag marks surrounding it like it had been pulled in every direction repeatedly. I backed out without turning around, stepping backward and gently shutting the door with my fingertips, barely touching it. I walked for hours afterward, didn't pause, didn't eat, just walked until the forest began to feel less suffocating. The light shifted, the trees spaced out a little. I found a fallen log and crouched behind it, pressed against my pack, while still clutching the knife. That's when I heard it again. Smooth and quiet, just behind the trees. "I saw you at the cabin." I stayed motionless. "You saw me." It kept circling, always 10 feet behind, never stepping into view. "Come see me again." No footsteps, no rustling, simply the voice forever shadowing me. I sprinted. Branches clawed at my face and arms, but I didn't care. My limbs burned. I bit down so hard on my tongue I could taste blood. And then I saw a flicker of firelight. Hikers gathered around a blaze, maybe 5 or 6 of them. College-aged, laughing, drinking, passing around a bag of marshmallows. I stumbled into their clearing, collapsing at the edge of their fire circle. They jumped up. One of them grasped my shoulders and asked if I was okay. I couldn't respond. I simply stared at the fire. I remained awake all night, leaning against a tree, vigilantly watching the dark. I didn't hear that voice again. The following morning, I followed them down a different trail, one I didn't recognize. 2 hours later, we arrived at a ranger station near the base. They went inside while I stayed outside on the concrete steps. Eventually, a ranger emerged and settled next to me. "Did you see anything unusual?" he queried. I didn't meet his gaze. I simply stated, "I went past the signs." I was 22 when I agreed to help my cousin clear out our old family cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It had been left unoccupied for nearly a decade after my great-uncle passed away there. My family avoided explaining the specifics of his death. They would simply say he was unwell, and when someone finally checked on him, they found him seated at the kitchen table, his eyes wide open, gazing at nothing in particular. I hadn't set foot in that cabin since childhood. The only memories I had were of the way the mountains enveloped the cabin and how the trees overhead were so dense that you couldn't discern where the sky began. My cousin Ezra repeatedly brought up the cabin. He insisted it was about salvaging anything of value, but I could tell he was merely too inquisitive for his own good. He wanted to understand why everyone treated the place as if it didn't exist. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The road wound higher and higher until my phone lost service and the GPS map morphed into a blank grid. The gravel driveway was nearly overrun with weeds and brambles. The moment I stepped out of the truck, an odd tightness gripped my chest, as if I had already made a mistake, but couldn't articulate why. Ezra appeared oblivious to anything amiss. He was too busy yanking boxes from the truck bed, treating it like we were merely doing some yard work. The front door stuck midway open, requiring Ezra to lean into it. When it finally yielded, it groaned deeply, sending shivers down my spine. Inside, everything emanated a stale scent, not precisely rotten, but sour, as though the cabin had been hermetically sealed for far too long. Dust blanketed every surface. A dented metal percolator sat on the stove. I found it peculiar that no one had cleared it out since my uncle's passing, as if the entire family had unanimously decided it was better to ignore the cabin. That first night, we attempted to act as though nothing was wrong. Ezra ignited a fire in the massive brick hearth, and we dragged in a few crates to sit on. We passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey, discussing anything we could think of that didn't pertain to the cabin, work, college, which aunts we found most annoying. For a moment, it actually worked. We felt like we were merely camping in a decrepit house, laughing off the sensation that something awaited us once the lights were out. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms upstairs. The air in mine still carried the scent of mothballs and something sour that clung to the curtains. The floorboards warped near the closet, and if you stepped incorrectly, they emitted a muffled creak that sounded eerily like a whisper. I left the door cracked open because the hinges screeched if moved more than an inch. I'm not sure what time it was when I was awakened by tapping. It was soft, akin to a fingernail brushing against wood. I lay there staring at the ceiling, hoping it was merely a branch brushing the roof, but then it came again. Slightly faster this time, almost like someone was trying to get my attention without generating a real noise. When I adjusted my gaze, I could see the outline of the doorway. Something was there. Half a face leaning into the gap, its skin so pale it seemed almost grey in the darkness. The mouth hung open, as if it was on the verge of speaking but had forgotten how. "Ezra!" My voice trembled mid-sentence. The face retreated soundlessly back into the hallway. I lay there, my heart racing against my ribs, my hands so cold I could hardly feel them. When nothing else moved, I finally pushed the blankets aside and crossed the hall. Ezra opened his door on my second knock, his hair a wild mess as he squinted at me, clearly still half asleep. "You were at my door," I whispered. Rubbing his eyes, he replied, "I wasn't. I was asleep." Rather than returning to my room, I sat on the floor next to his bed for nearly an hour, staring at the crack beneath the door, uncertain about leaving. He didn't tell me to go, but eventually sighed, muttering, "It was just a dream, Rowan." "Just a dream," I repeated, but I couldn't convince myself of that. The following morning, we attempted to drown our anxious memories in busy work. Ezra rummaged through boxes as if searching for something specific, though he wouldn't reveal what it was. Most of the contents were trash, old newspapers turning brittle and yellow, water-stained letters with unfamiliar handwriting, and a stack of fading black and white photos. One in particular stuck in my mind, a picture of my great-uncle standing on the ridge behind the cabin, his expression vacant, not sad, not angry, just blank, yet his head tilted slightly to the side as if he were listening to someone just out of view. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked long enough, something would suddenly come into focus behind him. After lunch, Ezra suggested we hike up there ourselves. He seemed nonchalant about it, but his voice was too flat. The trail led past the woodshed, which sagged precariously, looking like it might collapse at any moment. From the moment we entered the trees, that sensation of pressure returned, as though the air had thickened, encroaching on my ears and filling my head with a faint hum. Ezra plowed ahead as if he felt nothing. The path was little more than flattened grass and several scuffed footprints. The higher we climbed, the more the pressure mounted. My vision blurred at the edges, and I found myself swallowing repeatedly to pop my ears. When we reached the ridge, the ground dropped off sharply. The entire valley unfurled below us, an endless undulation of dark tree slopes. Ezra pointed down the hillside, and following his finger, I spotted it. A rickety structure made from scrap wood haphazardly assembled into a shack. A blue tarp drooped over one side of the roof. From that distance, I couldn't discern if it had been abandoned or if someone lurked inside watching us. "Do you think someone lives there?" I asked. He didn't answer straight away, squinting as though trying to peer through the trees. "When I was a kid," he finally said, "Uncle brought me up here." I swallowed hard, suddenly anxious. "Who?" Ezra shook his head. "I don't know." As we made our way back down, the pressure gradually dissipated, but the knot in my stomach persisted, as if we had intruded on something we weren't meant to witness. That night, I tried to convince myself nothing would happen. I repeated that the tapping had been a dream, that the ridge was merely an old hunting shack, that none of it held any significance. It was past midnight when the tapping resumed. This time it came from the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Initially, I tried to dismiss it as just a branch swaying in the wind, but then I laid eyes on it. A pale figure pressing against the glass, a face with indistinct bleached features, its mouth aligned perfectly with the lower pane. Fog billowed in short bursts with every breath it took. I was frozen, unable to scream, unable even to swallow. It lingered for so long that I began counting in my head, trying to distract myself. When I reached 30, the head slowly sank out of sight. I bolted into the hallway, crossed to Ezra's door, and flung it open. He was already awake, sitting up with his phone in hand. "You heard it?" I whispered. He averted his gaze. "Yeah, I heard it." He offered no further explanation. At dawn, we hurriedly packed our belongings. My hands trembled uncontrollably. Ezra moved about in silence, emigrating boxes without saying a word. When I glanced back at the trees, I caught sight of it again. Someone standing just beyond the line of trunks, too far away to see their face, but tall with arms hanging straight down. Their shoulders slumped, as though they hadn't figured out how to support their own weight. I forced myself to look away. The drive down felt infinite, every bend in the road seeming like the spot where that figure would emerge from the shadows. A week later, my phone buzzed around 3 a.m. It was Ezra's voice, flat, empty. I remembered something. He said, "Uncle said they don't like it when people come up to look at them." I attempted to ask who he meant, but before I could finish, He had hung up. I grew up in a small town called Elkford. Chances are, you haven't heard of it, just a cluster of houses crammed into a fold of the Allegheny foothills. No stoplights, no gas stations, just a bait shop that peddles coffee that tastes as stale as burnt cardboard. The house I ended up staying in belonged to my uncle. It was known as the place out by Nolan's Hollow, as if that explained everything. The narrow two-story structure was constructed from wood so aged it had turned grey. Its foundation consisted of stacked stones, some so cracked that you could lose your keys in the gaps. Throughout my life, I only visited for Thanksgiving, and even then, I wouldn't remain past sunset. However, last December, after everything in my life took a wrong turn, I decided to move in for a while. I kept telling myself this was temporary, a break to gather my thoughts and figure out what came next. My girlfriend had left the month prior, my hours at the mechanic shop had been cut, and my mom persistently called to check if I was managing, meaning she thought I was on the verge of falling apart, and probably wasn't wrong. So I loaded my truck with a mattress, a couple of boxes filled with books, some clothes, and headed out in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. The initial weeks weren't so dreadful. Days were quiet. I split wood behind the shed, patched the draftiest spots, and sipped coffee that tasted about as bad as what was served at the bait shop while lounging on the porch. But at night, the house had a knack for reminding me of my solitude. The beams would occasionally pop with these slow, cracking sounds that made me imagine someone pacing above me. I tried not to dwell on it. I kept the generator fueled and the propane tanks lined up in the mudroom. It merely seemed smarter to be prepared. Yes, I also had a revolver tucked in a small lockbox beside the bed. Not because I believed I'd need it, but because common sense dictated that folks in Elkford acted that way. Out there, you couldn't just assume you were safe because you locked the door. That night began like any other. I prepared some instant noodles that tasted roughly like warm glue, read an old paperback I had previously gone through twice, and completed the usual circuit to check the doors and windows. I had developed a routine of double-checking the deadbolts before retiring for the night. A part of me felt the necessity to see those locks engaged in order to believe they'd keep any threats at bay. Around 10, I noticed the first sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft scraping, as if something thin was being dragged across the porch. Initially, I didn't even look up from my book. There were plenty of animals in the vicinity, half-wild cats and raccoons that enjoyed climbing onto the railings. But then it came again, longer this time, a dry, papery sound culminating with 3 little taps against the door. I set my book down, spine up on the coffee table, and ambled over to the window beside the door. The porch appeared empty. The old rocking chair remained perfectly still, not even a tremor. I cracked the door open an inch, and a rush of frigid air hit me square in the face. It smelled damp and slightly sour, reminiscent of wet leaves left to rot. Leaning out far enough to peer left and right, I saw nothing stirring. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I shut the door and locked it again. My shoulders tightened, as if I anticipated something might leap from the darkness and seize me. Flicking off the lamp, I settled back down. My eyes adjusted slowly. The shapes became clear. The couch, the stack of firewood, the soft glow from the generator light in the kitchen. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or perhaps a branch that had fallen against the siding. However, right before midnight, the knock came. 3 short raps. Calm, as if the entity outside felt no need to rush. I stood abruptly, causing my book to tumble off the table and hit the floor with a thud. I refrained from calling out or questioning who it was. Instead, I approached the door and placed my palm flat against it. The wood felt cold, almost damp. "Hello," I said. Nothing. No shuffle of feet, not even the creak of the porch boards. I leaned in closer to the peephole. The porch remained unchanged, empty. I took a step back and locked the door again, just to be sure. My heart raced so fiercely, I felt a little lightheaded, akin to having just sprinted a mile. Returning to my chair, I picked up the revolver and laid it across my knees. I kept assuring myself this was in my head. It was merely an old house alone in the woods. There was nothing peculiar about creaks and knocks. An hour passed without any movement. Gradually, the adrenaline wore off and my arms grew numb from remaining still for so long. I began to think it was over, that whatever was there had given up and departed. Standing up to stretch my back, my legs felt stiff and clumsy. Perhaps I'd head upstairs to ensure the windows were locked before trying to get some sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Not a random creak, Actual footsteps, slow and purposeful, moving from the end of the hall to the top of the stairs. I froze, clutching the revolver so tightly my knuckles ached. I waited, hoping it would cease, but the steps continued, heavier this time, crossing back toward the spare room. I flicked on the lamp, and the light illuminated everything in a flat, washed-out manner. My hand instinctively went to the lockbox, only to realize it was already open. I had neglected to close it after cleaning the revolver a week prior. Checking the cylinder, confirming it was loaded, I steeled myself and made my way to the base of the stairs. "Anyone up there?" I called. No response. I took my first step, which groaned under my weight, and the footsteps resumed. Back and forth, deliberate as if they wanted me to hear. I climbed the landing, each step feeling as if it became increasingly difficult. My uncle's old bedroom door was slightly ajar. I raised the gun, my other hand finding the wall switch. I flicked it up. Nothing. The bulb had been functioning that afternoon. Pushing the door open with my shoulder, I found the room empty. Bare mattress, empty dresser drawers, the window secured. I slowly backed out, trying not to blink. Closing the door, I turned toward my room just as I heard it. A whisper from the other side of my door. It was a thin, papery voice, repeating the same string of words in an unfamiliar language. I cautiously inched closer, the revolver trembling in my grip. Pressing my ear against the door, I could feel my pulse pounding against the wood. I took a breath that felt too shallow to accomplish anything and swung the door open. Silence greeted me. The room appeared unchanged. My unmade bed, my duffel bag leaning against the closet. Then, from the corner of my eye, something shifted. A lean, tall figure gliding along the wall, wrapped in what resembled grave soil. I jerked the revolver up, finger hovering over the trigger. But before I could squeeze it, the figure vanished, slipping out the door. I backed away so quickly I collided with the dresser. I didn't even think. I turned and sprinted down the stairs, out the door, across the yard. My boots skidded on the gravel, but I didn't stop, running until I reached the bend where the trees opened up to the road. I paused there, bent over, gasping so fiercely it felt like my ribs may snap. My throat tasted metallic, almost like blood. Turning back, I saw the house standing silently, perfectly still. I remained there until dawn broke and never returned. At 23, I somehow fooled myself into believing that helping my uncle clear out an old hunting cabin he had inherited near the North Carolina-Tennessee border was a good idea. He had been unwell for months and couldn't make the journey himself. One evening, he called to tell me it would be simple. Just drive out there, pack a few boxes, and bring back anything worthwhile. He conveniently left out how dilapidated the place was, or that the road would devolve into something unrecognizable by the end. He also didn't mention that I'd be alone for hours with no cell service, no neighbors, and no one around. I remember leaving my little duplex before dawn. My backpack rested on the passenger seat alongside a thermos of coffee I never got around to drinking. For the first few hours, it felt like an ordinary trip. Flat highways, a few semis roaring past in the dark, exits spaced miles apart. But once I turned onto Route 212, the pavement rapidly deteriorated. Initially, it was just cracked asphalt with weeds poking up through the seams. Then it became gravel that pinged against the undercarriage each time I hit a rut. Eventually, the gravel disappeared altogether, leaving me crawling along a dirt track barely wider than my SUV. The trees grew denser as I advanced, with massive old poplars and maples leaning so close that it felt as if they were trying to shut me out. Here and there, I passed remnants of what once was: a rotting fence line, a rusted oil drum, the ribs of a barn that had caved in on itself. The air carried the scent of damp leaves mixed with something musty, reminiscent of wet wool neglected in a basement. By the time I reached the clearing, an uneasy prickling sensation crept up my neck, the feeling you get when you suspect someone is watching you, even when alone. I turned off the engine and sat gripping the wheel, attempting to reassure myself that I was simply overthinking it. The cabin appeared smaller than I had envisioned from my uncle's description. Squat, with a roof so warped that I could see daylight filtering between several shingles. The porch leaned awkwardly to one side, and a fleeting thought crossed my mind that stepping on the wrong board could send the entire structure tipping over. The yard wasn't truly a yard, just a patch of matted brown leaves and dead grass, with ridges rising up around it as though the hills were trying to conceal it. I stepped out, stretching my back until it cracked, and tested the front door. The knob felt gritty under my palm but turned easily enough. The moment I set foot inside, the smell nearly made me gag. A stale smoke layered over decaying wood, mixed with a sharp, sour scent that irritated my throat. I flipped the switch by the door out of habit. The result? Nothing. No flicker, no hum, merely dead silence. I stood there for a moment, allowing my eyes to adjust, and finally spotted a squat kerosene lantern sitting on the counter. Striking a match, I lit the wick, the tiny flame wavering in the glass and casting a pale glow across the cramped kitchen. The linoleum was cracked throughout, and dark stains marred the walls, looking far too old to be simple water damage. I tried to avoid staring too hard. I figured that the quicker I worked, the sooner I could leave. I began with the cabinets. Most were empty, harbored only mouse droppings and a couple of rusted cans with labels so faded that they had peeled away. Every time I reached into a shelf, a cloud of dust puffed into my face, making me cough. Among the discoveries was a mismatched set of plates that my uncle wanted, along with heavy mugs still possessing faint brown rings where someone had allowed coffee to dry. I packed everything into a box and set it by the door. The cabin was disturbingly quiet. Every creak of the floor felt like someone stepping up behind me. I continually glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a face in the doorway. At one point, I brushed against a curtain and found the fabric damp beneath my fingers. I wiped my hand on my jeans, forcing myself to concentrate on my task. After about 2 hours of sorting through cabinets and drawers, I felt like my head was stuffed with cotton. My back ached from hunching, and the lantern's meager pool of light made everything outside its reach seem darker. Reasoning that I could use a break to clear my mind, I stepped out onto the porch. That's when I noticed the wire. Strung between 2 trees about 20 feet away, it looked at first like an old clothesline, but upon closer inspection, I saw the little bones, bleached white, each one tied to the wire with strips of cloth. They were so small that I had to squint to guess their origin, perhaps from a rabbit or something even smaller. They swayed gently in the breeze. I couldn't help but feel driven to investigate further. The cloth had symbols drawn in dark ink, simple shapes that still appeared purposeful, circles intersected with straight lines, repeating over and over. I held my phone up to snap a picture, yet of course, there was no service. I took the photo anyway, merely out of habit. I lingered longer than intended, studying those bones. My stomach churned, the sensation akin to catching someone peering through my window at night. I turned back toward the cabin, telling myself I would pack swiftly and be out before darkness fell. But nothing ever goes as quickly as hoped. Time after time, I would think I had finished, only to find another drawer packed with various junk, bundles of wire, old fishing lures, a stained duffel bag that reeked of mildew. By the time I checked my watch, it was already nearing 6, and the clearing was almost entirely cloaked in shadows. I was carrying the last box to the door when I heard it. Something heavy moving through the trees, a slow, deliberate crunch of branches under weight. I stopped abruptly, almost dropping the box. For a few seconds, silence reigned. Then the noise returned, echoing from the other side of the clearing. My mouth went dry. I swallowed and placed the box down as quietly as I could. Logic screamed that it was probably a deer, but every hair on my arms stood on end. Then I heard the tapping. It originated low behind the cabin, 3 sharp raps like knuckles against wood. It paused and tapped again. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat. I knew stepping off the porch to investigate would lead to regret, so I remained still. The tapping advanced along the wall, inching toward the front corner. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. My palms turned slick with sweat. I closed the door and slid the bolt across, turning off the lantern to ensure that I wouldn't be seen from outside. Then, crouching low, I braced one hand against the floor, listening intently. The tapping ceased. A minute crawled by, then another. When the voice finally came, it sounded so close that I imagined it leaning against the wall. "You don't belong here." It was rough, as if the words were painful to utter. My breathing turned shallow, and I pressed a hand over my mouth, suppressing any sounds. Footsteps shuffled outside, growing closer. "You should leave it," the voice rasped. I swallowed hard, forcing my chest to move. "I'm just here to pack my uncle's things." Nothing. No answer. The footsteps faded away, sinking back into the trees. I crouched there, weighing my options. Sprint to the SUV or remain in the dark cabin all night. Neither choice appealed to me. I waited until the moon rose high enough to spill some light through the window. Hours dragged by without another noise. My legs felt numb from crouching, yet I didn't dare stand. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, A heavy thump slammed into the back wall. I flinched hard enough to almost drop the lantern. Another thump followed, then another, leading to a steady pounding that circled the cabin in perfect rhythm. Each impact was measured, like fists keeping time. My hands trembled as I relit the lantern and approached the door, pressing my ear against it. I listened intently. The pounding stopped. Cracking the door open, I found nothing but the clearing and trees. I nearly laughed in relief until I glanced over at the wire. All the bones had vanished, leaving only the sagging twine behind. That was all it took. I bolted across the porch, my boots slipping on the boards. I didn't look back. Instead, I slammed into the SUV door, jumped inside, locked everything, and shoved the key into the ignition. When the headlights illuminated the tree line, I caught a glimpse of them. Dozens of tall shapes standing between the trunks. They were motionless. No faces were visible, only the outlines of shoulders and heads. I didn't waste any time. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, feeling the tires bounce over the ruts. In the rearview mirror, the clearing appeared empty, but a gut feeling told me they wouldn't remain there forever. I made it back to the main road in half the time. I didn't breathe easy until I pulled into a gas station in Darnell under the buzzing lights. There, I sat gripping the wheel, sweat cooling on my neck, waiting for my hands to quit shaking. Back in October 2019, my cousin Josh called me. We hadn't spoken for months, but he sounded thrilled, saying he needed help dismantling an old hunting cabin his grandfather had built in the late 60s. He mentioned it was far out in the Appalachian Mountains, near a ridgeline his granddad used to hunt. There was no address, no driveway, just a trailhead past a rusted gate, followed by a couple of miles of hiking. He mentioned the cabin was in disrepair and needed to be cleared out before winter set in. Josh was thinking of putting a yurt there or something similar. I didn't inquire too deeply. I was broke, unemployed, and honestly seeking an excuse to leave town. He offered me a few $100 for the weekend and suggested we might sell anything salvageable. Old wood, hardware, and even antiques if we got exceptionally fortunate. I didn't hesitate. I packed a duffel bag and departed the following morning. We met up on Friday afternoon at a rundown gas station approximately an hour outside Fairburn. Josh arrived in his beat-up Tacoma, already loaded with tools and a cooler that rattled every time he hit the brakes. He handed me a paper map, the type locals buy when their phones lose service, and grinned like we were embarking on a treasure hunt. I should have sensed that something was off. We continued driving for another hour along gravel roads that appeared untouched for decades. At one point, a deer just stood in the middle of the road, staring at us like we were the intruders. Eventually, the road came to an end at a rusted iron gate secured with a padlock that appeared to have fused due to rust. Josh didn't even attempt to try the lock. He just led me around to the side and onto a barely traversable trail. He assured me it was a swift hike, but that hike quickly proved to be a nightmare. The terrain was steep and muddy, leaving me uncertain if we were still on a path or merely bushwhacking. Wet leaves covered the ground, and we kept slipping underfoot. Halfway up the first incline, I was gasping for breath, while Josh bulldozed ahead with barely a drop of sweat. After what felt like an hour, we finally reached the top of a ridge, and there, nestled in a little hollow, stood the cabin. It looked like it had been losing the battle against gravity for some time. One corner had already sunken into the ground, and the entire structure leaned slightly to one side. Comprised of thick, hand-cut timber blackened with rot, the door dangled precariously, and there were no windows, only solid walls and a sagging roof that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Josh, radiant, as if he had unearthed a hidden ship, declared, "I told you it was still here." I wasn't focused on the cabin, but rather on the door. There were deep gouges along the bottom third, not mere scratches, but actual grooves. 4 or 5 of them, perfectly spaced, running horizontally. I crouched down, running my fingers over one. The wood splintered under my touch. Josh noticed my intense gaze and claimed it was probably bears messing with things out here. I muttered, "Sure, bears." We dropped our packs and got to work. Step 1 involved stripping the roof so we could access the beams underneath. The shingles crumbled the instant we touched them, disintegrating into dust. The rafters sat pitch black and brittle. Each time we pried one off, it snapped with a dry, crackling sound. Then, a distinctive odor enveloped us, a nauseating wave of something chemical, sour, almost sweet. It wasn't mold or merely rot, but something much worse. I had to step outside and breathe through my sleeve. Josh offered up the theory of a dead possum hidden in the walls, and I didn't argue. Even though the scent definitely didn't stem from something natural, it felt wrong in a way that escaped precise description. We labored until it became too dark to continue, with no electricity, no cell service, and no backup generator, just our headlamps and a fire made from the dry timber we had already pulled. Josh cracked open 2 beers and handed one to me, which I held but didn't drink. When bedtime approached, we rolled out our sleeping bags onto a patch of floor that didn't creak much. The air was cold, and the damp wood made everything feel slightly sticky. I lay there, staring up at the beams, waiting for them to give way. Sometime after midnight, I heard it knocking. 3 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate, directly beneath us. I sat up, holding my breath, listening intently. Silence. Perhaps it was merely a figment of my imagination. But then it came again. Thump, thump, thump. I leaned over to shake Josh awake. "Hey, wake up!" He groaned in irritation. "What?" "There's something beneath the floor." He blinked, annoyed, and replied, "It's raccoons, man. Go back to sleep." I laid back down, but sleep was impossible after that. I kept watching the flickering firelight dance through the cracks of the walls. While the knocking never resurfaced, the silence that followed proved to be worse. No wind, no insects, no sounds at all, as if the woods were collectively holding their breath. By morning, I crawled beneath the cabin, where there was barely 3 feet of space, just enough to shimmy in with a flashlight. I scanned the area, finding webs, crickets, a few nails. But then I spotted something peculiar. Near the central beam was a mound of dirt that appeared different, evidently dug up and clumsily buried again. I called Josh over, and we began digging it out with our hands, finding burlap, old and decaying. It crumbled in places. Josh, with his knife, cut it open and we both froze. Inside were bones, 3 skulls, smaller than they ought to be, child-sized. We stared in silence for a while before Josh finally ventured. "You think he—" I nodded, and he left the question incomplete. We buried them again, deeper this time, placing a flat stone over the site. Josh suggested we should wait before contacting law enforcement. He worried it would raise suspicions surrounding his grandfather, the land, and even our presence there. I chose not to press further, not inclined to explain any of this either. The remainder of the day passed uneasily, and that night, I sat outside watching the woods in quiet. After 2 a.m., I caught sight of a light, a soft orange glow moving gently among the trees, oscillating like a lantern. I contemplated whether I was hallucinating when Josh emerged and stood beside me. "Do you see that?" I inquired. He nodded in agreement. We followed it. The light drifted just ahead of us, always just beyond our reach. We hastened our pace, later breaking into a jog. Yet, every time we came close, it pulled away, further into the foliage. Trees began emerging where there had been none. Moments prior, obscuring paths we had walked just an hour ago. The air became odd, too still, as if we were ensconced in a sealed room rather than outdoors. After about 15 minutes, Josh stopped. "We're lost," he declared. "This doesn't feel right. Where's the trail?" We turned around, yet nothing looked familiar. Everything had transformed into a mere sea of trees. Then we heard it. The knocking again, 4 knocks followed by 3, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. And then we saw it, stepping out from behind a tree, tall and human-shaped, but distorted, with arms far too long and legs bending backward. Its head was a void, an absence where a face should have been, cloaked in shadow no matter the angle from which we observed it. It tilted sideways, not walking, merely a slow, unnatural tilt. Without thinking, we bolted. No words exchanged, just fleeing until we emerged back in a clearing, yet something felt amiss. The cabin appeared renewed, not merely repaired or restored, but as though time itself had reset. The roof was whole, the walls impeccably clean, its fire pit untouched. Our tools had vanished, and the boards we had stripped were nailed back into place. Josh whispered in astonishment, "This isn't the same place." As we stepped inside, we found no signs of our sleeping bags. The floor was intact, devoid of damage. Just a pristine, untouched cabin. That was when we heard the footsteps from above. There was no second floor. Heavy boots slamming against the wooden planks, slow pacing followed by dragging. We exited before it came to a halt, not daring to glance back, sprinting through the trees until sunlight broke through the canopy. The trail was alive again as if it had never disappeared, but my car was absent. We trekked barefoot for 5 miles until a logging truck finally rounded the bend. The driver slowed, rolled down his window and asked, "What the hell happened to you?" Josh's hands were still bleeding, and I was caked in mud from head to toe. Words eluded us. He simply regarded us for a moment before opening the door, allowing us to climb inside. My name's Matt, and at 28, I readily agreed to watch my cousin Emily's dog, Daisy. Emily and her husband Craig had settled into a cabin deep within the Smoky Mountains near a small town called Fairbridge, which barely boasted a post office. It was one of those places that claimed to be off-grid but wasn't truly so, featuring solar panels, a composting toilet, a backup generator, while they still watched Hulu and ordered random kitchen gadgets from Amazon weekly. They needed someone to look after Daisy while they attended a wedding in Knoxville for one of Craig's college friends. And I had no pressing obligations that weekend, so I said sure. In truth, the idea sounded lovely, a peaceful cabin escape, devoid of office emails and traffic, just me, a dog, and perhaps a few beers on the porch. I packed 3 books I had started but never completed, thinking I would finally manage to finish one of them. The cabin was quite impressive. 2 stories, sizable wooden beams, and a porch wrapping entirely around it, like a scene from a magazine. The roof was black corrugated metal, emitting sharp pings each time an acorn struck. A frequent occurrence. Situated in a clearing, thick woods enveloped the cabin on all sides, with no other houses visible in sight. The absence of traffic noise, airplane overhead, just the sounds of bugs, birds, and tree leaves rustling in the breeze. No cell service unless I climbed the steep trail behind the cabin and stood atop a rock roughly the size of a car hood, holding my phone high as though it were an offering to the satellite gods. No calls were made. The Wi-Fi worked sporadically, but was slow enough to make even accessing Gmail feel risky. The first night went smoothly. Daisy remained glued to me, following me from room to room as if fearing I'd disappear at any moment. I made a small fire using a starter log, microwaved some leftover chili from the fridge, and fell asleep on the couch with my book resting across my chest. It was tranquil with no ongoing drama. Yet at 2:30 a.m, Daisy growled, a low, rumbling growl from deep within her chest, and her body went rigid, while her gaze bore into the front door, as if something on the other side had whispered her name. I sat up abruptly, causing my book to tumble to the floor. Though my eyes were hardly open, my heart raced already. The fire had dwindled down to only a few dim embers. Outside the window, it was midnight black, so dark I couldn't even see my hand. The little solar lights lining the gravel path flickered feebly, as if deciding between working or fading altogether. At first, I heard nothing but silence, punctuated by Daisy pacing between me and the door. Her nails clicked quietly on the hardwood floor as she'd stop, intensely stare, growl again, and repeat. Quietly, I rose from my seat, moved towards the door, and glanced through the peephole. Nothing, just the porch, railing, and beyond that, trees piled on one another until shadows swelled. I lingered, waiting for movement. Something, anything. A shifting branch, a wandering animal. But it felt merely like staring at a photograph rendered still. Locking the deadbolt once more, I stood for a moment longer before returning to the couch. Sleep eluded me. I lay there with my eyes half open, tuning into every creak and pop within the cabin, mulling over whether I had remembered to lock the back door. The next morning, I tried to rationalize everything. It could have been a raccoon or coyote drawn too close, and Daisy picked up the scent, something wholly plausible. Still, outside with her, I kept her leash clipped tightly and grabbed the old hiking stick leaning beside the front door as a precaution. Behind the cabin loomed a logging trail leading into the hills. Emily had mentioned it, explaining it's been there for ages, a remnant from when the area was home to working mills. I assumed it'd be a suitable spot for Daisy to expend her energy. However, we didn't venture very far. Perhaps a quarter-mile uphill I spotted them. Footprints, human and bare. The mud was soft from recent rains, making the impressions clear. Long toes, high arches, deep heels. They weren't mine, nor Craig's. These were fresh, no leaves laid upon them or heavy rainwater pulling in. They appeared crisp going uphill. Daisy froze too, no longer growling, but tense. Her ears lifted and her tail lowered. We turned around without rushing, but I didn't dawdle either. That night, I reassured myself it meant nothing. Maybe a peculiar hiker, some barefoot nature enthusiast, perhaps someone camping nearby. I even Googled barefoot hikers using the cabin's Wi-Fi, which took an eternity to load. But yes, from what I gathered, that was indeed a thing. Regardless, I kept all the lights ablaze, double-checked the locks, and resumed sitting on the couch with a movie playing in silence. At 1:50 a.m., Daisy jarred me awake. This time it was a soft whine. She remained perfectly still in front of the door, her attention fixated on it, ears flat against her head, her body stiff. I muted the television and listened. Then I heard it, creaking wood. One step, another on the porch. I stood, inching slowly to the peephole once again. My hands felt clammy and my stomach twisted like riding a roller coaster. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing barefoot on the top step of the porch, pale skin and wiry arms. His shoulders slumped as though he bore the weight of something unseen. He didn't face the door, instead staring into the woods, merely standing there, motionless and silent, with a slight sway. Something about him felt deeply disjointed. Not like someone who appeared ill, but rather someone who simply did not belong. He stood like that for about a full minute before stepping down and strolling back into the trees. Undisturbed and unsound, sleep remained elusive, forcing me to sit there grasping the axe I discovered earlier that day in the shed. I kept every light on, flinching at every little movement from Daisy in her sleep. By morning, I packed a bag and tried calling Emily, encountering no luck. With no bars and barely working Wi-Fi, I couldn't afford to frighten her for no reason, yet I refused to stay another night. However, I found myself having no choice. I couldn't arrange a ride out, nor was I keen on the idea of hiking 10 miles back to town with Daisy in a duffel bag. That night, I gathered all the porch furniture inside, wedged a chair against the front door handle, another under the back, and rechecked every window. 3:12 a.m., I heard 3 knocks. Not on the door, but on the wall beside the front window, hollow and deliberate. My heart raced, my breath stopped, and I froze. Suddenly, a soft rattle emanated from the back door. The handle flicked just once. A slight twitch, a test, and then silence. Nothing occurred after that. When morning finally dawned, the furniture I had used to block the doors had shifted slightly. Someone had pushed. A subtle resistance felt, but nothing had actually broken. That was it. I stuffed my belongings into the trunk. Daisy had already seated herself in the back before I even opened the door. I drove until reaching a gas station near the county line with decent signal. Upon finally connecting with Emily, I relayed everything to her. I tried to make it sound nonchalant. Hey, it's no big deal, but there was a man on your porch for 2 consecutive nights, and now I'm leaving with your dog. She laughed at first, though it was clear her laughter didn't carry its usual resonance. As I loaded my final belongings into the trunk, Daisy barked. Not at the house, but at the woods, and before I could react, she was off, dashing in pursuit, a sprint of about 50 feet before I managed to catch up. Daisy had frozen, fixated on something ahead. What lay before us was a tree with a piece of string dangling from one of its branches. Stripped fabric attached, likely from a child's shirt, stained and dirtied. Beneath it, a dark smear nailed into the bark caught my eye. Had to be blood. Then the carvings revealed themselves. 6 trees formed a rough circle, each with a face crudely cut into their bark. They had hollow eyes and wide mouths, more than symbols, more than art, just grotesque staring faces, all observing inward, as if watching a fire that had long since extinguished. Grabbing Daisy, I didn't halt until reaching the road, dropping her off at a friend's place in Asheville, followed by a 5-minute voicemail to Emily urging her to return early. I used to work on trails for the Forest Service, a role I held for most of my 20s. It was a perfect fit for me, not because I was passionate about conservation or embraced the ranger lifestyle, but because I relished the silence. I enjoyed moving through trees without engaging in small talk. The majority of my work involved maintenance, clearing brush, replenishing first aid supplies, fixing signage, and occasionally hauling back tents and gear left behind when people panicked or got turned around. You wouldn't believe how frequently individuals walk into the woods like they're strolling through a mall and then vanish like smoke. That area has a reputation for it. The ridge swallows things, including people, and most folks don't grasp what that truly entails until they witness it. I did more than once. My main post was about a mile outside of Grayson Hollow, a town you blink and miss. You pass through it rather than go to it, a place that seems to exist solely because someone forgot to shut it down. The surrounding forest was dense and largely untouched. Some areas felt ancient in a way that was hard to articulate. as if they remembered things that you didn't. Locals referred to it as the Cradle Gorge. I heard that name countless times, but only from elderly residents who had lived there long and rarely spoke about the woods. You'd think it was just a nickname, something poetic, but no one in uniform jested about it, especially not after what happened on October 18, 2014. It was a Saturday. Dispatch notified us just after 5:30 p.m. A man named Daniel Levin and his 9-year-old son Mason had ventured out for a 2-day loop hike. Standard route, Briarcliff through Devil's Spire. It's rugged but manageable. They were supposed to check back in by noon. When they didn't, and their Subaru was still parked at the trailhead, we were called out. I teamed up with Shelton and Jules. Shelton had been on the job for 12 years by then, a quiet, steady guy who didn't talk much, but his attentiveness was evident. Jules was the new recruit, fresh from training but adept. She asked insightful questions and knew how to maintain her pace without wasting energy. Some people burn out quickly on their initial extensive trek, but she moved as if she'd been doing this since middle school. We didn't waste time. We grabbed our packs, radios, and medical kits before heading onto the trail just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. At first it felt routine. This part of the forest had some rugged terrain, sharp drops, tangled switchbacks, and sections where a perfectly marked trail seemed to vanish beneath moss or a rock slide. We lose people yearly, usually those who didn't bring enough water or strayed too far off the loop. 90% make it back the next morning with nothing worse than a bad blister or bruised pride. But that evening, something felt off. About 20 minutes in, that crawling sensation hit me, not exactly fear, more like friction, as if I entered a room right after a fight. Even if everything appeared quiet, the air was still charged. It was subtle, but it began early and lingered. 40 minutes in, we found the jacket, a bright red one belonging to Mason. I remember how strikingly out of place it looked, draped over a branch as if someone had taken the time to fold it neatly instead of just dropping it. Jules knelt beside it, letting her fingers hover above the fabric like she didn't want to touch it directly. "This wasn't just dropped," she said softly. "Someone placed this here." She was correct. No dirt, no tears, no dew. Completely dry as if it had been positioned moments before our arrival. We logged the coordinates and continued. Approximately 20 minutes later, Shelton radioed, "CA, you got a minute?" "Yeah, what's up?" "I'm looking at something. Might be a structure, but it's not man-made. I'm not sure what it is." That piqued my interest. Shelton doesn't make speculations. I found him in a clearing, barely 10 feet wide, surrounded by trees that leaned in, almost as if trying to hide what lay within. In the center was this object. It resembled a totem, but not in any way I recognized. Made from bark, feathers, woven twine, strips of leather or hide, and lots of bone, none of them deer or anything I could identify. It leaned forward at a weird angle, almost reaching out. Standing about chest high, I circled it slowly, unsure whether to get closer. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" Shelton asked, glued to the spot. "Nope. Do you want to touch it?" "Hell no." We flagged it in the GPS and pressed on. I already had a sense that was a mistake. You don't stumble upon something like that without something guiding you toward it. About 15 minutes later, Jules came over the radio with a different tone, tense. "I'm hearing something north of where I'm positioned. Sounds like a voice. Are you sure it's not an echo?" "I've been standing still for 5 minutes. Whatever it is, it's moving and repeating something over and over. It's not English. I don't think it's a real language." We tightened our formation. I caught up with her first. She was crouched down, breathing through her nose, eyes locked on the tree line as if she were expecting it to blink. "There's something on the other side of that ridge," she whispered. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. It halted when I moved. That's when we decided to set up camp. Not because anyone proposed resting, but we were simply too deep in to turn back before dark, and nobody wanted to navigate those woods alone after sunset. Even Shelton didn't argue. We built a small fire, just enough for light. None of us were speaking at that point, just listening. Around 2:30 a.m., something shifted. I noticed it first. It passed just beyond the firelight, tall and narrow. Its limbs didn't swing naturally. Its shoulders didn't dip while stepping. There was no crunch of leaves, no snapping twigs. Jules caught sight of it next, then Shelton. It circled us slowly once, as if measuring us, and then vanished. Jules leaned closer and whispered, "Did you see its face?" I shook my head. It didn't have one. The next day we located Mason. He was sitting in a grove, back straight, legs crossed, almost as if he had been placed that way. He looked at us but offered no response. His lips moved, yet no sound emerged, just a hollow little loop of whispers. We checked him over. No bruises, no scratches, no signs of exposure, and his clothes were pristine. Not just sitting passively clean, but laundry day clean, as if he had been outfitted with fresh clothes. When I touched his arm, it was icy. We called for a medevac, but the canopy was too tight for them to land. We would have to carry him. He didn't resist, didn't react at all. Midway back, he began humming 3 notes repeatedly, off-key and far too slow, like a lullaby played backward. Jewel clapped her hands over her ears, and I nearly dropped him. Shelton muttered, "That's not a normal kid." I didn't argue. At base, the medical team said, "Shock, severe trauma." But nothing accounted for the eyes. He didn't blink, not once. His father was never found. No gear, no tracks. It was as if he had simply vanished. The grove we discovered Mason in didn't appear on any maps. I returned once after that, a different set of coordinates, yet it was just dense woods with no clearing and the totem gone. I filed the report and quit the next day without an inquiry as to why. Jules transferred out a month later, while Shelton relocated to Oregon. Now, I work night shifts in a warehouse on the edge of town. At 26, I agreed to assist an old friend in clearing out his late uncle's hunting cabin, hidden away beyond Greyfield Ridge in a hollow rarely mentioned. He called me one Thursday night, sounding as if he were trying not to disturb someone in the adjacent room. He promised to pay me if I joined him, insisting he couldn't handle it alone. We had known each other since high school, back when we used to hike those ridge trails armed with cheap cameras and sort out strange finds. Animal bones, rusted traps, old bottles. He had never once referenced the land that belonged to his family. I asked why it had to be that particular weekend. He told me the county had finally sent a letter. If he didn't get the place cleaned up, they would condemn it. His voice cracked when he mentioned that, like he had been holding the words in for far too long. I didn't press him for more details. My own work had dried up, so I figured it was yet another messy job to help cover rent. We met at dawn behind a gas station in Carrick, a little place that appeared abandoned even with the lights on. His truck was already loaded, a tarp tied across the crates, and a crowbar wedged between the boxes. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red, and he hadn't shaved. I nearly asked if he was ill, but he was already slipping into the driver's seat. The drive felt longer than it likely was. First, the road shifted to gravel. Then, the gravel turned into rough dirt riddled with potholes. The trees crowded around us so closely that their branches slapped against the truck's mirrors. Throughout the drive, I couldn't help thinking that he still hadn't explained why he had never told me about this place. Neither of us spoke much. He kept his hands locked onto the wheel, as though letting go would cause the truck to drift into the trees and disappear. When we finally arrived, the cabin was in worse shape than I had anticipated. It looked untouched for half a century. The porch sagged heavily into the dirt. All the windows were covered with boards that had aged so much they began to warp. A rusty lantern hung by the door, swaying slightly, and I couldn't suppress the thought of why. He turned off the engine but remained still. We lingered there long enough that I pondered whether he might doze off with his eyes open. Eventually, he rummaged through the glove compartment, fished out a key, and held it out without glancing at me. His hands were trembling. I stepped onto the porch to test the lock. The moment I turned it, the metal crumbled. My palm returned covered in flaky rust. The latch fell to the ground with a hollow thud, and the door swung open slowly as though it were waiting for us. The smell assaulted me immediately, like wet fur left to decay, mingled with the sour aroma of old leather and something sharp I couldn't identify. Looking back to see if he were coming in, I noted he stood by the truck, staring into the entrance. For a fleeting moment, I genuinely thought he might return to the cab and drive off without a word. Instead, he gave a single nod, as if making a decision, and stepped inside behind me. We began hauling items outdoors in silence. There was a warped dining table that took both of us to move, nearly falling apart in our hands. A stack of moldy magazines was so stuck together that I had to pry them apart with the crowbar. Boxes of clothes disintegrated into dust at my touch. He spoke very little, only muttering, "Careful," whenever I reached near the back room. Each time I glanced over, I found him fixated on that closed door, his jaw clenched. After a couple of hours, we paused for lunch. He perched on the tailgate, shoulders hunched as he picked at the label on his water bottle. I attempted to lighten the atmosphere by asking if he had ever spent a night here as a child. He shook his head and finally stated that his uncle had disappeared when he was 7. Walked into the trees one morning and never returned. His mother hadn't spoken of it. She would merely state that there were reasons they kept their distance. He seemed on the verge of revealing more, but hesitated. Returning indoors, he headed straight for the back room. I followed, even though my instincts told me not to. The boards covering that window were thicker than the others, and it was dark enough that it took time for my eyes to acclimate. In the corner sat a large cedar trunk, the only thing remaining in that room. I attempted to lift the lid, but it was heavier than I expected. When I finally managed to force it open, the hinges creaked like an ailing animal, causing me to flinch back as I nearly knocked over a broken chair. Inside lay neatly folded clothing, and on top of them was something wrapped in canvas and tied with twine. I hesitated, but sensing his presence behind me, I began unwrapping the fabric. What I uncovered was a small axe, the blade tarnished with a dark, shiny substance. My stomach flipped at the mere sight of it. He let out a sound that was half gasp, half grunt, reaching past me to pick it up. His fingers trembled, and he placed it back in the trunk delicately, like it was precious. "We'll leave that for last," he murmured, his voice low. I chose not to ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. We continued working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. A few times I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, steady pacing. Whenever I paused to listen, they grew silent. Once I thought I heard heavy breathing on the other side of the wall near the boarded-up window. Around 4, he mentioned he needed to inspect the generator shed behind the cabin. Flashlight in hand, he exited, leaving me behind. I stood there, waiting for the door to creak shut, but it never happened. After a few minutes, feeling restless, I began stacking boxes near the entrance, trying to occupy myself, but the silence felt suffocating. Glancing outside, I noticed the sky darkening. I stood for another minute before stepping out onto the porch. The path to the shed was barely visible beneath the leaves. Halfway there, I called out his name, but no reply. Upon reaching the shed, I found the door standing ajar, and the flashlight beam bobbed haphazardly across the floor. Leaning in, squinting to see better, I observed nothing but a rusted generator, a broken plastic chair, and a few crates slumped against the walls. I picked up the flashlight. Turning, the beam landed on the boards, and I noticed the word "stay" carved in so deeply that the wood began to split. Stepping back, I sensed something shift behind the crates. At first, I assumed it was an animal crouching low, but then it unfurled itself. Thin limbs, ribs conspicuously stretching the skin tight. It rose taller than me, head tilted sideways, my throat constricted. Before I could utter a word, it spoke. Nera. The voice was hauntingly familiar, echoing my father's, as though he stood right next to me. I wanted to reply, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. The figure advanced slowly, hands dragging along the dirt. Its face was smooth, devoid of eyes and mouth, but the voice remained crystal clear. Mirror. I turned and fled. My foot caught on something, and I collapsed hard. My shoulders screamed in protest. I didn't stop. I crawled through leaves and branches, snaring my hair until I regained sight of the clearing. My friend stood on the porch, merely watching me. No wave, no call, just a blank stare. I yelled that something lurked in the shed, but he turned away as though he hadn't heard and walked into the cabin. I scrambled after him, my heart pounding against my ribs. Inside was dark, save for a line of light falling across the cedar trunk. He had vanished. I tore through each room, opened closets, cabinets, anywhere a person could hide, finding nothing. Retreating into the front room, I gripped the flashlight like it was my only lifeline. Clicking it on, I swept it across the boards nailed across the front window. That's when I noticed the pale, jointed fingers slowly curling over the edge of the plywood. I bolted out the door, down the steps. His truck remained running, the keys swinging in the ignition as if he had stepped away for just a moment. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat trembling. My breath came in ragged bursts I couldn't seem to control. I'm uncertain how long I stared at that cabin, maybe an hour. Long enough for shadows to begin swallowing the clearing. Something stirred behind the boards, tall and thin. It pressed against the slats. It tilted its head as if deciding whether or not to chase after me. I turned the key. The engine sputtered before finally starting. I reversed so fast that gravel flew up and clattered against the cabin. My last glance in the mirror caught that shape still watching through the cracks. I didn't ease off the gas until I hit the main highway. After finally stopping, I called the sheriff, and they dispatched a search team, including dogs and everything else. They found no trace of him. No footprints near the shed. No indication anyone had been there at all. When they asked if I was certain of what I had witnessed, I simply stared at the ground. I was 24 when I had the bright idea to ride that old service road behind my grandfather's place in eastern Tennessee. My uncle often spoke of that hollow as if it were an indelible stain in our family history. Leaning back in his chair, fiddling with the label on his beer, he would say things like, "That hollow is older than any grave you'll find around here." Then he would abruptly change the topic as if realizing he was about to divulge too much. I always assumed it was superstition, just a way to deter kids from wandering too far into the woods and risking snake bites or getting lost. I hadn't returned to that house in ages, not since my teenage years. Upon my grandfather's passing, someone had to clear out the remnants, and it turned out that there was a lot to sift through. The place appeared as though it had been striving to sink back into the hillside the moment he died. Kudzu was engulfing everything, climbing up the porch, wrapping around the gutters, pushing its way through window screens. The old satellite dish was bent in half beneath the weight of the vines, and even the porch swing had collapsed, as if it too had given up. The inside was no better. Each room emitted a blend of mildew, old newspapers, and that sour hint of mouse droppings. It was the kind of odor that clings to your clothes and hair, leaving you burdened with it even after you leave. All day long, I dragged boxes outside, bundles of moth-eaten quilts, stacks of water-damaged magazines, jars of who knows what, so long sealed that the labels had peeled off. I kept telling myself I was making headway, but no matter where I looked, there was another corner packed to overflowing with stuff. By dusk, my shoulders ached so badly, it felt as if my arms had transformed into lead pipes. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the counter, realizing how much quieter it was without him. That's when I noticed the Polaris keys dangling from a bent nail by the doorframe. Such an ordinary little thing, yet it struck me with a wave of memories. I used to ride that ATV all over the property, tearing down trails while my grandfather leaned against the porch railing, pretending he wasn't watching. He never commented, just squinted at me, waiting to see if I would do something foolish. Usually I did. I can't quite explain what compelled me to take it out that evening. Perhaps it was the silence weighing down on me, or maybe I wanted to recall what it felt like to be a carefree kid before all of life's responsibilities came crashing down. I didn't think too hard about it. I simply grabbed the keys, swung my leg over the seat, and cranked the engine. I set off up the trail behind the barn, the same rutted path that had endured since my first visit as a young child. Back then, it felt endless, as if it led all the way to the edge of the world. The first section was cracked pavement, grass creeping in along the edges, while the old fence sagged between leaning posts. After about a mile, the pavement transitioned into hard-packed clay. The ruts jolted my spine every few yards, my teeth even clacked together once, and I had a fleeting, silly thought that I might chip one. I went past an old hunting blind resting in a black walnut tree, just some grey plywood nailed to the trunk, but it had definitely deteriorated over the years. The side panels hung in tatters, and the ladder was broken halfway up, splintered in a way that suggested something large had put its weight on it. Without meaning to, I slowed down. A prickly sensation crept up my arms. I considered turning back, but I pushed the notion aside, reassuring myself it was all mere old wood, and the results of too many rainy seasons. I continued for another 15 minutes. The trail opened into a broad clearing, a shallow basin in the earth encircled by black locust trees. 3 trailers sat there in a crooked half circle, appearing as if they had been dragged out there decades ago, only to be left abandoned, rusting in place. The siding was riddled with holes, the windows punched out, and the doors entirely missing. A thought flickered through my mind. It looked like a place where nothing good ever transpired. The kind of location you'd expect to find buzzards scavenging. Then I spotted the tire tracks, fresh, undeniably clear. The dirt was still soft where the tread had pressed in. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, absorbing the silence. It wasn't the usual silence either. There were no birds, no insects, just a hollow stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Swinging my leg off the ATV, I felt my boots sink into the damp earth. Each step took longer than expected, like wading through something denser than air. When I reached the nearest trailer, I had to brace myself against the doorway because my legs felt unsteady. Inside, the floor was hidden beneath old leaves and fragments of stained carpet. In the far corner lay a pile of bones, small ones, possibly dogs or deer, all meticulously arranged and picked clean, like someone had purposefully aligned them. I turned to exit when I noticed twine strung across the doorway. Little grey shapes dangled from it, gently clacking in a breeze I couldn't feel. Leaning closer, I squinted, momentarily mistaking them for rocks. Then reality hit. They were skulls, each drilled through and threaded like beads. My throat constricted. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a piece of broken concrete. My heart raced, pounding so violently I felt as if it might choke me. I should have left right then. Hopped back on the ATV and ridden far away, but a small part of me had to know where those tracks led. It wasn't curiosity precisely. It was more a dull determination to see it through, as if stopping halfway would haunt me forever. So I followed the trail beyond the trailers. The path shrank into switchbacks winding down through the trees. Now and then, wooden boards nailed to the trunks displayed symbols I didn't recognize. Circles slashed with diagonal lines, spirals coiled around stick figures. Some looked as if they had been drawn with something that dried brown and flaked away when the wind blew. I tried not to ruminate on that too deeply. I couldn't tell you how long I walked. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. But it felt as if the sun was slipping away faster than it should have, as though time itself was attempting to nudge me out of there. Finally, the trail leveled into a hollow so deep that dusk almost settled in. A collapsed stone foundation sagged into the hillside, and a doorway gaped at me, a black maw large enough to walk through if one really felt inclined. Cautiously, I edged closer, and a wave of odor assaulted me about 6 feet away. A thick, sweet rot that clung to the back of my throat. I gagged, quickly pulling my shirt over my nose. My flashlight weighed heavily in my hand. I clicked it on and directed the beam inside. In the far corner, a pile of burlap sacks shifted with a slow, deliberate movement, as if something within was attempting to roll over. I heard a scraping breath, low and wet. My knees felt weak. For a heartbeat, I thought I might collapse directly into the doorway. I took a step back, but before I could move another inch, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze, my thoughts evaporating. When I turned, I saw a man beside me. He wore a battered canvas hat pulled low over his face, his beard unkempt, and his mouth twisted into a polite, humorless smile. "Don't go in there," he said, as if he were directing me to the post office. I couldn't utter a word or shift my position. He raised a finger to his lips. "You don't belong here. Turn around." Yet I remained paralyzed, my body entirely tense. He leaned closer. His breath smelled like soil after rain. "Run!" He released me, and the invisible force that held me captive snapped, allowing me to spin around and dash up the trail. My legs shook uncontrollably, nearly causing me to fall twice. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I'd see something I could never erase from my mind. I lost track of time on my way back to the clearing. The trailers loomed in the twilight, their empty windows gaping. I scrambled onto the ATV, my hands trembling so severely that I almost dropped the keys. When the engine finally roared to life, I turned too sharply and fishtailed in the dirt. I revved the engine and sped up the hill, not caring in the least whether I ruined the suspension. I didn't slow down until the barn roof peeked through the trees. Parking by the porch, I clutched the handlebars, struggling to conjure a coherent explanation for everything I'd experienced. Every attempt sounded as if it belonged in a poorly written horror novel. When dawn finally broke, I loaded the last of my belongings into the truck. I didn't call the sheriff. Instead, I tucked the keys under the loose brick on the porch and drove away. I grew up just outside a town called Spruce Glen, tucked in the western corner of North Carolina, a small area you'd miss if you blinked, yet right against the Blue Ridge Mountains, which made it perfect for me. I didn't hold much affection for malls or movies while growing up. To me, the woods were always a better choice. By age 15, I was hiking solo nearly every weekend. My parents probably trusted me more than they should have, but I provided no reason for concern. I avoided GPS and never brought printed maps. Didn't need them. I could tell my location thanks to the sound of a creek or the feel of a trail beneath my boots. That stretch of forest felt like a second skin. Early September 2016, I received a call from my cousin Nate, who lives in Savannah. Something felt wrong immediately upon answering. He didn't ease into the conversation, just stated he was coming apart. His girlfriend had suddenly left him, and he was drinking too much, not sleeping. He needed to disappear. Wanted space in a quiet and empty place. I encouraged him to come up. He arrived the following afternoon in his rickety old Civic, that sounded as if it could fall apart any second. He stepped out looking frail, pale with puffy eyes, as if he hadn't blinked in hours. He carried a tattered duffel bag that likely hadn't seen a wash in years, just 2 changes of clothes and half a bottle of Jim Beam. He said he wanted to hike, to get far enough that his phone would be useless and no one could locate us if they sought. He mentioned he needed to feel small again, whatever that entailed. I told him Linville Gorge would accomplish just that. Nothing but nature around us. He asked whether we could complete a loop in 2 days. I stated, yes, as long as we pack light and maintain a good pace. The plan was to go down Spence Ridge into the gorge, cross the river, then circle around back to the car within about 36 hours. We set off the next morning just after 10 pong. The trail remained bone dry and the air was stagnant, feeling like it hadn't moved in days. Nate wasn't in great shape as he huffed heavily just 20 minutes in, stopping on every hill to catch his breath. I could have hiked faster on my own, but I didn't mind taking it slow. We weren't in any hurry. We covered 6 miles before setting up camp by a ridge. It was a nice spot. Flat ground offered a decent view of table rocks extending beyond the trees. Still, something about the place made my skin crawl. It felt too quiet, not peaceful, just hollow, almost as if the woods were listening. We prepared a fire and cooked up a lackluster meal, freeze-dried chili that tasted like cardboard. Nate hardly finished his, muttering something about needing a reset before crashing before the stars fully emerged. I sat alone for a stretch, zoning out, prodding at mud on my boots while half watching the trees and trying not to dwell on the eerie silence. Suddenly I heard footsteps, crisp and even. About 20 feet out, my body locked up. They were too heavy to belong to a deer or a fox, and too measured like someone was trying to be heard, but not to conceal themselves. The steps paused and I remained still. Again, they began. It was a slow, deliberate loop around the tent, not crashing through brush but merely pacing. Then silence returned. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing. I swept the light through the trees. Every branch appeared to harbor someone. I stood there for 5 full minutes, barely breathing, hoping for movement, but nothing stirred. I crawled back inside, zipped it all up, and kept my eyes open until dawn came. When Nate woke, I recounted the ordeal. He just smirked, suggesting it was likely a deer. I retorted, "Deer don't circle people like they're taking stock." He shrugged it off, but he remained much quieter that morning than usual. We packed up quickly and journeyed deeper east. By early afternoon, we were dropping into the gorge. The trail wasn't made for comfort. It was steep and narrow with countless switchbacks and rocky scrambles. I noticed a change in Nate instead of the usual banter as a knot twisted in my chest. I kept glancing back over my shoulder without realizing it. We scouted for a place to camp just past the river crossing. It felt tight with trees tightly packed. Even when sunlight showed, the light remained dim in our little space. A heritage fire ring likely abandoned years ago stood there when Nate finally managed to get the flame going, poured himself a drink, and offered me the bottle. I declined, and he simply nodded. Later on, after midnight, we heard it. A whistle. A long note, without a pattern. Just a sound prolonged too long to be natural, too close to ignore, yet far enough to obscure where it originated. "Did you hear that?" I inquired. Nate didn't hesitate as he declared, "Yeah, that wasn't a coyote. Let's extinguish the lantern." We sat there, shrouded in darkness for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe even more, until another whistle pierced the silence. Closer this time. Then there was only silence, not the usual kind. No bugs, no frogs, no wind, not even the breeze. Suddenly, we heard movements, branches cracking, leaves rustling, something creeping slowly, clearly pacing along the fringe of trees, checking, then nothing again. We lay there, cloaked in total darkness, hearts racing, waiting. Neither of us managed to sleep. At first light, I informed Nate we would consider taking a shortcut. I remembered an old service road not on maps that could save us a good 5 miles and get us out more swiftly. He nodded, accepting this idea, and we moved quickly, avoiding conversation. Every sound felt as though it bore significance and held implications aimed at us. Even bird calls appeared feigned. Around noon, we paused for water. That's when I spotted it. A carving at eye level in a tree. A perfect circle adorned with a diagonal slash through it, like a tilted zero. Cleanly cut as if pierced by a sharp knife. I remained quiet about it. We carried onwards, But soon I encountered more of them at consistent intervals. Each one was the same size, same shape, sharp and new. Eventually, I stopped indicating them altogether, opting to press on until we reached the older service road later in the day. It was rugged but evidently navigable. We refrained from taking breaks, just marching onward. At 8 p.m., we witnessed a glowing lantern stationed in the center of the path. Not flickering, not wavering, merely illuminated. Our pace faltered. Leaning closer, Nate whispered, "You think that's a ranger?" I didn't respond as I dared take a single step forward. The lantern extinguished instantly. No click, no footsteps, just absolute darkness encroaching upon us. I yanked Nate off of the road and into the woods. We crouched in earnest, listening in apprehension. After 5 minutes, we heard that whistle again, an exact replication of the previous, now echoing from behind us. Footsteps followed, multiple, slow, even, like a crowd walking in lockstep down the very same path we had just traversed. We said nothing, adopting a quiet urgency as we shifted through the underbrush parallel to the road. Every branch beneath felt ready to snap. The road curled onward, and ahead, another lantern swayed gracefully from a branch. Yet beneath it, a figure stood still. He seemed manlike, too still, too upright. He never turned or shifted. He only remained there under the lantern's glow. Continuing onward, the trees finally became sparse, exposing the forsaken forestry station. Windows were boarded and the roof half collapsed, yet a truck sat there, a faded red one that seemed long forgotten. We checked inside. The keys remained under the visor. I never questioned it. I turned on the ignition and fled the scene. We didn't stop, not once, until we reached a ranger outpost located just inside county lines. I shared nothing. What would I have relayed? I never revisited Linville Gorge again. I was 26 that summer when I made the decision to solo hike a stretch of the Appalachian Trail. Not for any significant spiritual awakening, or to search for myself or anything dramatic like that. I wasn't freshly out of a breakup or trying to escape a troubled past. I just felt the need to unplug. Too many texts, too many emails, far too much of everyone else's noise echoing in my head. I figured if I couldn't hear them, perhaps I would finally hear myself. I chose a section in Virginia, somewhere between a quiet little town named LaVille and the edge of the George Washington National Forest. It wasn't the most secluded spot in the country, but it wasn't a tourist trap either. I yearned for isolation, and this stretch offered just that. No cell service, barely any foot traffic, long stretches of nothing but trees. That felt ideal. My gear wasn't particularly fancy, but it was decent. Rugged boots, new but not quite broken in. A cheap ultralight tent acquired secondhand. A bear bag, one of those noisy silver emergency blankets, and a knife clipped to my belt for peace of mind. I had enough dehydrated meals to last me, alongside a printed map and compass I barely knew how to use. I wasn't reckless, rather optimistic. I just figured 4 days alone in the woods would do me good. Hit the reset button. The first day unfolded almost exactly as I hoped. I made good progress. The trail wound up ridge lines and dipped through hollows, all shaded in that specific green that only emerges deep in forests like these. Dark, almost damp looking, as if it soaked into the bark. It was quiet, but not devoid of life. Chipmunks darted across the path, and I occasionally detected the sharp taps of a woodpecker. I didn't encounter anyone else, just me among the trees. I even found myself smiling at one point for no particular reason. That night, I set up my tent on a mossy rise about 30 yards off the trail. The ground was soft and dry. I strung my food up appropriately, crawled into my bag, and listened to the creaks and pops of the forest settling down for the night. It wasn't frightening, just calm. I found it quite beautiful. The second day started early. My back ached a little from the ground, but I felt good, energized. That morning, I spotted 2 older guys headed the opposite way, likely finishing their own journey. We nodded at one another, but didn't engage in conversation. By afternoon, I had ventured far enough that the woods felt denser and less maintained. I discovered a flat area near a fallen tree and established camp again. That evening was unremarkable. I boiled water for one of those meal pouches, something like beef stroganoff that tasted like salt and regret. Yet I was hungry enough not to mind. I watched the fire until darkness enveloped everything, then extinguished it, zipped into my tent, and closed my eyes. At some point after midnight, I awoke. It wasn't sound that roused me, not really. It felt more like my brain fired on all cylinders at once, like my body sensed something before my mind caught up. I was wide awake suddenly, not groggy or confused, just alert. Initially, I didn't hear anything. No wind, no crickets. The silence was dense. I remember it distinctly. The silence felt heavy. Then I heard it. A laugh, short and sharp, like someone attempting to suppress laughter but failing. It echoed weirdly, reverberating among the trees, making it impossible to determine its source. It wasn't close, but it felt uncomfortably near. Then, silence returned, a crushing stillness enveloping me again. I lay there rigid, my eyes wide in the dark, ears straining for any continuity. Nothing came. My hand found the knife at my side and remained there for the duration of the night. I didn't sleep again, not even for a moment. When morning finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I stuffed everything into my pack, skipped breakfast, and hit the trail quickly. Every faint sound made my stomach lurch, twigs snapping, leaves fluttering. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, even knowing how foolish it was. The trail wove through tighter spots that day, areas where the forest seemed to close in around me. Rock overhangs and blind switchbacks made it feel like something was lurking. I kept my eyes darting around. Every branch felt like it could conceal something, and every shadow appeared a bit too still. That night, I decided against camping near the trail and trudged deep into the woods. I must have bushwhacked about a quarter mile before locating a hollow between two dead stumps, establishing camp there with no line of sight to the trail. That was the goal. I believed if someone were messing around out there, I'd be undetectable. I attempted to sleep. My body screamed for rest, legs tight, feet sore, shoulders burdened, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. I lay there, tuning into the forest, when it struck me again. I was wide awake, no sound, no warning, only whispers drifting just outside the tent. Not a single voice. Several, definitely human yet too faint to comprehend. But it was undoubtedly not the wind. I remained still, barely breathing. The tone felt strange, not casual conversation, but rhythmic, almost like a chant. Not in English or any language I recognized. It looped like a lullaby hummed by someone who had never heard a genuine one. My knife lay hidden beneath my backpack. I reached for it slowly, each muscle trembling. Footsteps began circling the tent, light, soft, deliberate. Each step was slow enough to count. And then, the zipper wasn't opened. It was touched. Fingers glided along it, testing the fabric. That soft hiss filled the air. The whispers ceased. Everything went still. I remained frozen, knife in hand, pulse pounding in my ears, my back rigid, each muscle taut like it might snap. I maintained that position for an hour, maybe longer. Eventually, I realized the sounds were gone. Nothing but the usual quiet returned. At sunrise, I packed up and left within minutes. No breakfast, no checking my map, just movement. My legs felt dead, but the adrenaline propelled me. Then I noticed the carvings. The first was simply a deep gash in a tree. But then came another and another. They were unnatural. Symbols, circles with lines through them, stacked triangles, sharp hooks, deep, clean cuts, resembling craftsmanship. They kept appearing. Every few minutes, another one. The fresh bark still curling at the edges. That's when I spotted him, on a slope perhaps 30 or 35 yards away, standing still, shirtless, his skin so pale it appeared grey. Hair long and matted, just watching, not hiding, not blinking, merely standing there. I didn't pause, didn't look back. I just kept moving as if stopping would leave me frozen. I didn't camp that night. I pressed on until my body gave in and found a rocky outcrop collapsing beside it. No fire, no food, just my back against the stone and eyes fixated on the darkness that lay ahead. Around 2 a.m, I saw it again. Firelight flickering far off, beyond a ridge. Not one flame, but a collection, moving together like a dozen torches. The glow pulsed unevenly. I could hear voices chanting now, rising like a crowd, rhythmic and practiced. I grabbed my pack and left, not running, not wanting to attract attention, just moving quickly and quietly through the underbrush. I slipped twice and scraped my arm on something sharp, blood trickling down into my palm. I didn't stop. At some point the trail vanished, or perhaps I diverted from it. I didn't know. I didn't care. I just kept pushing until I hit pavement. Old, cracked, overgrown with weeds and broken branches. No signs, no markings, but it felt human. I followed it. About 2 miles later, a truck rounded the bend. A battered blue pickup with a ladder strapped down in back. I stepped into the road, waving my arms like a lunatic. The driver slowed, window rolling down. "You all right?" he asked. But I didn't bother to respond to the question. "Can I get a ride?" He sized me up, then said, "Get in." That's the end of the paraphrased script. Each story retains its essence while interchanging sentence structures and phrases.